back to the show. This is The Law Show on CL 650.
I want to get away. I want to fly away. Yeah, yeah.
Hey, and welcome back to the show. Speaking of flying away, we do have a segment on passports in just a little while, so we'll get to that in a second. Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic are here from MKS Law in downtown Vancouver, immigration and citizenship lawyers, and we're getting into parents and grandparents and the lottery, and it's not the 649. So explain what the lottery is. I guess it's a pool of people that come into the country, right?
Yeah. So in immigration, you have what's called a family category, right? So
wasn't this family reunification?
Exactly. So this was a major platform that the Liberals ran on. That immigration is not just about economics; it's also about family. Family is important, and that they believe in the parent and grandparent class. And the Conservatives had really constricted that. Before there was no limitation on how many people could apply under that category. And what happened is you had massive backlogs. So the Conservatives instituted.
Wasn't it 5 years at one point?
Exactly.
Worse.
Yeah.
In some cases worse.
And wasn't it a year or so ago that they just said the backlog no longer exists?
Well, they still have a backlog, but it's been limited. You could file an application now and have it processed conceivably, I'd say less than 2 years, right?
Yeah, well, what happened was between November of 2011 and November of 2013, they actually, until the program reopened in January 2014, they stopped taking new applications.
And then when they reopened it, basically they limited, they put a tight, saying we're only going to take 5,000 applications every year. So this backlog's not going to, we're going to process 20,000 people every year, and we're only going to take 5,000 applications every year. That way this backlog's going to come down. And so the problem with that is with only 5,000 people, 5,000 applications, there's probably about 20,000 people out there that want to apply, right? And that was the number 4. So they made some other changes to make it tougher to get in. But what happened was, to be able to get in, firms such as ourselves, we made sure we were ready on day one, because what happens is every calendar year they would open the door basically and say, okay, we're going to take 5,000 and then we're going to close the door.
You told a story one time that you actually have a guy stand in line.
Oh, we'd pay extra to have a courier down there in Toronto when it opened on January 2nd to make sure he had all our applications ready to go. Because
that's a lousy job standing out in the
2
cold.
hours.
We paid extra. He was paid. He was well paid for that. He could go have a coffee afterwards. So
that's cruel.
But I mean, it created a system that was a little bit crazy. That to sort of get, it was a little disorderly, and basically everybody trying to sort of rush in, and they were getting over 10,000 applications, which means they'd have to send back 5,000 of these applications that weren't processed.
Where are we at now?
So now they've gone to this lottery system. I think Alex, if you want to talk about him.
So essentially, last year, they ran on a policy platform that they would increase this category to 10,000 completed applications, but they didn't announce that they were going to do that until after a crisis hit them. So last year in 2016, on January 2nd and 3rd, actually January 4th and 5th, I think it opened last year, they received, within 3 days, they received 14,000 completed applications, and they were only going to take 5, and they had 5 on day one. So they made a split decision to go a year earlier on increasing it to 10, and then they returned 4,000 applications. The people that had taken steps to get in their application on day one were largely rewarded for this, and everybody else who couldn't get 2-day courier service from the parts of the country that basically, if you hadn't got a courier, on December 30th,
in the snow for 2 hours,
you were hooped.
Out of luck, yeah.
And this is fine if you're in Vancouver or in Toronto, where the processing center is, or in Calgary, or a big city where you had FedEx service and you could arrange for something like this. But if you were in a smaller center, this was impossible. And so, really, there was an element here that if this system continued the same way,
it's discriminatory.
There would be an element of discrimination. It's not your fault that you live in wherever it is, and does the person in northern Manitoba not have the same right to bring their parent to Canada as someone in Winnipeg or Calgary? So the government had to change something. So they announced in December that they would go to a lottery. And essentially how the system now works is the program opened again on the 3rd of January, much like it did last year, except now between the 3rd of January and the 2nd of February, all you have to do to participate is you go onto their website and fill in an online form that you're interested in sponsoring your parents and grandparents. There's a few trigger questions that ask you if you meet the income requirements and a few other things like that. But otherwise, there's very little to that application.
So it's basically hand raisers, people that are saying
hand
we're
raisers,
interested.
yes.
Yeah.
And then that will close on February the 2nd, on Groundhog's Day, after which the government will, once they've closed off intake of new interested people, they will then go to a lottery and choose 10,000 out of however many they get. So what are people's chances? I've heard varying. I have my own theories, but before you get to my theories, Rudy, what have you heard on this subject?
I think, if we got 15,000 applications last year, I think it's getting, it's difficult to qualify. The changes that they put in made it, the income requirements are a lot harder to get in. I think because they're not vetting people going in, so it's not a completed application.
So there's going to be a lot of attrition.
I think there's going to be a lot of attrition is my worry. So you're going to end up with, a lot more people applying and a lot fewer people actually qualifying, right? So I think you'd probably have at least a 50% chance of getting in, I would think.
That's my thought. On the internet, there's a few people who've put forward the theory that your chances are going to be 20 or 25%, but that really presupposes 40,000 applications. We've never had a year where we had 40,000 applications.
But if you make it just hand raisers, you might.
Yeah.
It's possible.
You don't have to pay a fee, right? Before you'd have to pay a fee.
You have to pay a fee,
put the application in.
I can't believe the government's not charging a fee because all of these...
Well, if you're chosen, you are.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, so anything more on parents and grandparents? It's kind of a sit back and wait and see what happens?
Well, the lottery, they have not announced an official date for the lottery, but what I've heard informally is that it will be around the 15th of February.
Oh, so shortly after.
And once the announcement is made, the lucky candidates will be given a firm 90-day window to apply for permanent residence or to sponsor their parents. And if they don't take that opportunity within those 90 days, they lose their spot.
And then someone else gets it. Okay, so we've talked about parents and grandparents and the lottery, February 2nd. So what's your advice to people that might be listening is to just go to the government website and what do you do?
No, I think definitely call an immigration lawyer. I think
don't do it on your own.
Don't do it. That's my recommendation. I don't think you don't want to get people's hopes up. You don't want to be calling your mother or grandmother saying, "Oh, we're putting this application."
So what you should do is ask the pertinent questions, or you'll ask them if they're even going to qualify.
Yeah.
So don't bother if you're not.
If you're bankrupt, if you think that the relationship qualifies, if you've sponsored somebody in the past that might disqualify you, you think the income, you made enough money, but it was actually through a corporation, you didn't pay yourself, and therefore the income doesn't qualify. There's all these other sort of little things that could trip you up.
So you know all the right questions to ask.
And unfortunately, the worry is that a lot of these people won't qualify for that reason. Also, people need to be aware that if they're sponsoring an elderly person, that person has to pass a medical exam. The advantage that we can tell you now is where those issues are going to arise later. For you to win a lottery and then actually submit an application, pay money, and just get refused is a waste of everybody's time. And plus, you may be taking a space from someone who is qualified. So it would probably be best that you get advice before you do anything further.
Okay, well, there you go. That is your free advice. All right. So we go from parents and grandparents to spousal sponsorships. What's going on there?
Well, on December 14th, the government made a major policy announcement on spouses and processing of spouses. Processing of spouses is one of the largest categories of Canadian immigration. And the complaint has been over the past several years that processing has taken a very, very long time. In the inside of Canada category, for example, you were looking at 26-month processing as average. And overseas, you're looking at between 12 and 16 months. There was a feeling generally that this is out of whack with Canadian practice over the last 20 years, and there had to be a way to bring that back, to rein that in somehow.
Because these people are already married.
They're already married, yes. So the federal government looked at some options and has come up with a comprehensive plan. First, we were very gratified to hear that they have invested $25 million into this new initiative, which includes more officers, a new application form package. It's actually quite streamlined compared to the other one. And it asks for more specific information than the previous ones did. So those are good things. And that's putting more officers out in the field to deal with these applications.
So how much do they want to contract this waiting time?
Well, they're hoping, they're guaranteed, what they're saying is 80% of the applications processed within 12 months, right? Which, is a stark difference between the 27 months that we're hearing about. You got to think of the absurdity from a Canadian taxpayer point of view when, the Conservatives put in a policy of this express entry. We're going to get the best and the brightest, and we're going to get them here fast, and we're going to process them in 6 months. So here you are, a Canadian. You want your wife here, the mother of your child here, perhaps. And guess what? Somebody who has never paid a cent of Canadian tax and is sitting overseas is going to get their immigration done faster than you are to get your wife here, right? It really makes absolutely no sense. And it's the right move by, I think, the Liberal Party to sort of address this. I mean, who's the most important member of your family? Your spouse. Well, why shouldn't that be done at a reasonable pace? You know?
Totally naive question. What would hold up somebody who's married? I mean, you've married a Canadian from them not coming in.
You got to realize, I mean, our world is divided. I think, it's important for our listeners to sort of recognize this. There's a big, which, it always shocks me, people, is that as a Canadian, you have a great luxury with this passport that you can get on and you can go to any Western country you want. You can go down, you can travel to most countries in the world without needing a visa, and you get on a plane and go where you want. The rest of the world isn't like that. And if you're married to somebody who's from the Philippines, for example, they are not able to get on a plane without getting a visa. The minute they write down, I want to go visit my husband, guess what 99% of the time is going to happen to that visa request? It's going to get refused.
By the Philippines?
No, by the Canadian government. Yeah. We're saying, we don't know why you're coming here. We're not sure you have a genuine relationship, and we're going to wait until we process that because we don't want you to come here and then just stay because you have no incentive to go back if your supposed husband is here. So we're going to process you while you're overseas.
So it's all about the proof of the relationship and really being married.
Well, and it just takes time, and putting it as a priority to process in time. I mean, they don't spend more than 15 minutes on these applications for the most part. If they interview them, then maybe they're spending an hour in total. But the reality is they just don't put it as a priority. So what the past government did was put as a priority, a business that wants somebody to be working for them over that of a spouse of a Canadian who's paying taxes and wants his wife here. It's obnoxious.
In your expertise, having dealt with these cases, how many people try to get into the country by marriage that aren't really married or have no relationship?
It's traditionally very common in Canada.
It's common.
Very common. Oh, yeah.
I mean, you'd say it's common from certain... I mean, to give you an example, I mean, for cases where it's an American applicant, 99% of those are granted without interview and legit, right? I mean, they're not a concern,
So this is an area of abuse in the past.
It has been.
It has been. Yeah.
No question.
And so, I mean, I'm not saying that those people should be allowed to come without get the visa to come, but I think the processing time should be sped up.
We did a previous show where we addressed the way their algorithm systems work now. I mean, they've built in some excellent social science research into their global case management that deals with common traits that capture fake relationships, gross disparities in age, gross disparities in education level, particularly in favor of the applicant versus the sponsor. There's the ways that they can capture these types of applications is a lot more sophisticated than it used to be. Mm-hmm. The filters are better. The mechanized filters are better than the automatic ones are better than they used to be as well. But the pendulum really swung in the last 5 years towards enforcement. And this is, in a way, a return back the other way. And in fact, I'm not actually sure that we're swinging back against enforcement. There's always a balance here between being vigilant and being quick, right? Between being facilitative in terms of legitimate relationships and being vigilant against fake ones. Part of the idea here of throwing more resources at this is you can do the same amount of vigilance without having to necessarily not make the category the priority that it should be. And that's the balance that I think they're trying to achieve.
All right. When we come back after the break, we're going to get into immigration levels. Change again. As you mentioned, things change quickly in your line of work. The ETA passport qualifications and more when we come back talking about immigration law with Rudy Kisher and Alex Stojkovic from MKS Law next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.